This is the seventh and final lecture for the first half of our class, Philosophy 220, a study of ethics. This first half, we've been looking at the theoretical aspect of ethics. When we move into Lecture 8 for the second half of the semester, we'll be looking to apply these ethical theories that we've learned about. In this lecture, we're looking at virtue ethics.
Okay, the concept of virtues in Western traditions typically arrives from our Greek classical tradition, and this is putting the emphasis in a very different place than what we saw with either deontological or teleological approaches to ethics. This time, instead of looking at the particular action or the consequences of an action and deciding if that's a good or bad thing, a right or wrong thing, we are now looking at the actual person to see if this person has characteristics, or what we actually call virtues, that make the person a good person or a bad person. So if you'll see the italicized text on this first bullet, the importance in virtue ethics is placed upon being a good person before you're actually capable of doing a good action. The primary teacher of this tradition is the ancient philosopher Aristotle, 4th century BC or BCE. He is often presented as our very first virtue ethicist, as expounded in his work, Nicomachean Ethics. If you are familiar with the classical tradition, many will point to Socrates as the first great teacher in that tradition. Some of you may be aware that there are many academics that consider Socrates to be a fictional character in the work of Plato. Plato actually presents Socrates as his teacher in literature, but again, many feel that Plato maybe created this character of Socrates. And then Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. No question that Plato and Aristotle were historical figures. Whereas Plato actually looked into the mind and the internal working of the mind to try to determine what was real and what actually existed and what was good and what was perfect. Aristotle, his student, will turn to the outside world and use the senses and observation to determine what is right and good. And we've actually seen these two traditions continue in philosophy and even in ethics over the next 2,000 plus years, that we have some thinkers that have a natural bent to turn inward to the life of the mind to think philosophically, and then there are other thinkers who turn to the outside world and use observation to make their determinations. Within Aristotelian virtue ethics, the greatest good is considered eudaimonia, which Aristotle would in English describe as the happiness or the flourishing of humanity. And so a virtue is anything that is going to progress human nature, make humans better beings. And Aristotle, this is somewhat unique to him, believes that eudaimonia can be achieved through careful attention to the golden mean. And this is using the term mean as in the term average. If you want to think of a clock here that has a pendulum, and you see the clock swinging to the left and swinging to the right, Aristotle describes when it is furthest to the left and furthest to the right, it is the farthest away from what is actually the good. You've actually gone one extreme or the other extreme. And Aristotle, in stressing moderation, taught that life should be lived best staying away from those extremes. So imagine the pendulum coming back and settling right in the middle, and Aristotle would call that place the golden mean, where you are living with the best virtue, living with the best characteristics or personality traits of being a good person. Okay, we did have virtue ethics fall by the wayside for many hundreds of years. In the modern period, which we oftentimes mark sometime around in the late 15 or early 1600s, we do have Enlightenment modes of thinking leading philosophers to pursue the other approaches to ethics that we've already looked at this semester, such as the deontological or the teleological path. The idea that you have with the Enlightenment or modern thinking is that humanity is able to reason completely objectively, that we have now reached a stage where we don't allow subjectivity to come into our ethical thinking. And so within the Enlightenment, it really is a pompous view or an arrogant view of humanity that we can figure out all of these things, not just in the realm of ethics, but in every field of study. With very, very little argument, it has been quite clear since the 1940s and 50s, we have reached a postmodern era in which humanity has been humbled. We see within the postmodern era that there's a very big importance on community, that rather than having this sort of universal perspective where we can understand all things objectively, all of us, every single one of us, is grounded in a particular community or culture that forms the way we think and forms the way that we understand. And communities are shaped by a particular narrative or story. So when we talk about the postmodern era, we are placing a great deal of emphasis upon community and the narrative that has formed that community. And you can see listed here around this picture. By the way, this, if you've not seen this figure at the bottom of the slide here, this is a figure that's been used by philosophers and spiritual teachers for, I would say, close to 2,000 years, if not longer than that. And the figure is called the Enneagram, and it emphasizes the 9 points that you have here. And this Enneagram is one presenting virtues, and so you can see at least 9 virtues. There are certainly many, many more, but these are 9 virtues that one Enneagram teacher was stressing. Okay, as mentioned, community plays a very important role in virtue ethics. And there are, I want to address something that your author, or a couple of things that your author had in the textbook, because I will show my cards here. I am a huge proponent of virtue ethics and consider myself a virtue ethicist over against a deontological or teleological ethicist. So the author of your textbook and many other philosophers are critical when evaluating virtue ethics, claiming that it is either too subjective, okay, just looking at your community, just looking at your story as forming what the virtues are. And also, when you try to practically apply virtue ethics, many critics will say that you can't actually do that. How do you take goodness? How do you take honesty and put that into action? They say the only way you can put it into action is that the goodness or the honesty will unfold in some sort of rule, which would be deontological ethics, or perhaps unfold in looking at the consequences of an action, which would of course be our teleological ethics. So some critics will say that virtue ethics may look nice on paper, may look nice on a PowerPoint slide, but if you try to actually apply virtue ethics, as soon as you apply it, you're actually doing deontological or teleological ethics. In response to that, I would say all ethics are going to be subjective. It's one thing the postmodern era has shown us. So even if you are doing ethics deontologically or teleologically, there is a subjective component there also. And I'll also say to the aspect of sliding into deontological or teleological ethics, certainly that may play a part, but it is still the virtue that is driving the determination of how the virtue is to be applied. So I'm fine with admitting that virtue ethics will oftentimes have a deontological or a teleological component, but that's not where the moral reasoning or the ethical vision began. It still began with this concept of what it means to be the good person, what it means to be a virtuous person. And another thing that needs to be realized is that, yes, sometimes virtues will conflict with one another, and within each particular community, shaped by its particular narrative, there will always be an ordering of the virtues. Decisions will be made within the community, and reflection upon the narratives or the stories that are authoritative for that community about which virtue is most important. Is it love? Is it justice? Is it compassion? Is it honesty? So again, every community is going to make those decisions, and then individuals within the community will make their own personal decisions about the ranking of the virtue. But community, and again, narrative, very important to virtue ethics. Okay, and I'm very glad that your textbook took time to introduce the ethics of care. Virtue ethics has had this new question that it's had to deal with concerning care, because the concept for the longest time was that the greatest moral good, the greatest ethical outcome would be this sort of objective, hands-off, blind justice, that you don't take anyone's personal history into account, and the idea of being sympathetic or compassionate was considered a sort of ethical or moral weakness, that you just objectively look at the black and white rule, or the black and white consequences, plain as day, and you try to be blind and administer justice that way. So you got this great picture here with the new concept, or the new virtue that has been introduced, and that is care or compassion. Here you have a statue of blind justice to wield her power in an ethical dilemma, and this angelic figure behind her is representing care or compassion, with her hand extended, saying, hold on here, there's another part of this equation we might want to consider. Now, your author presents this as having been considered by some primarily a difference between the way women and men think. That men think more in terms of just get the fair thing done, the just thing done, and women with a nurturing component to the personality are going to focus on this concept of care and compassion. I don't want to, I guess, completely dismiss that, but I certainly don't think it's that simplistic. I know many women who would continue to be very dogged in wanting some sort of blind justice administered, and I know many men who are going to emphasize compassion and care and want to soften that concept of blind justice. But it is virtue ethics that brings us to this new question. Do we simply strive for objective blind justice, or do we want to have an element of care and compassion? And if so, how much? So this is yet another element that, again, is brought to the table by virtue ethics.